This is one in the same cannon. The oldest photograph that I know of Fort Phoenix was with the troops standing here. And if you notice in that photograph, there is no magazine. Now this is the magazine. The magazine was built and intended to hold 50,000 pounds of black powder. And that includes a 5-foot crust of concrete on the top, just below the dirt line. The walls are granite, 8 foot thick. There's a 13-foot, 15-foot, 6-foot tunnel going into the main room. The main room has 2 feet of brick in an arched fashion, and the reason for the arched fashion, should there be an explosion within the magazine, it would not rip the overhead. The pressure would roll around and come back down to the base floor. And also standing here was 2 buildings of interest, starting at the corner of the block. And if you look very closely, you'll see that the foundation is still below. At the base of the stone that we're looking at, that small square granite block, was the hearth fireplace. It's still intact there. Next to it are the stairs, the granite steps going down, and that's still intact. There's a wood cord chute halfway down the line if you follow the foundation. We were allowed to dig there back in '69, not being archaeologists, and of course any archaeologists who were worth their salt would have frowned on the way we attacked the problem. But you know, we were amateur, the town saw only good, and they allowed us to do it, and we only dug up half of it. We got bullets and other artifacts, a lot of bones were analyzed. We thought they might be human, but that was not true. Now that was a 2-story garrison house. The first floor was the area where they fed the troops, and that's why the hearth fireplace is there. There was a great fire there in August 11th, 1872, and in that fire, the custodian, Sergeant Wetzel, who was maintaining the property for the government, got burned very badly. The local fire brigade did not get here in time, and thus the house was lost. The second building that was here during, as part of the Civil War fortress, there was a 2-story garrison house where the non-coms and the quartermaster were housed. It was almost connecting the magazine. And that went down sometime after the turn of the century. You know, we can look around the fort and see different various plaques commemorating certain occasions. Of course, this is the British landing in 1778, put there in 1930 by the Daughters of the American Revolution Fort Phoenix chapter. There's also documentation on the large boulder standing to the rear of us here, commemorating Daniel Eggery's role in saving the fort. There seems to be somewhat questionable in interpretation, and one may believe that he didn't in fact save the fort. He just came in to harass. There were hotheads in those days, but I'm not going to try to twist history. I'll let the reader decide for himself whether he was in fact trying to counterattack a large British force or just trying to harass. That stone was rolled up here. It used to be down in the valley. It was called the Rolling Stone. It was rolled and dragged up here by horses, and the plaque was attached there as a commemorative event in 1905. This is strictly a Civil War magazine. We attached the door in 1969. We're given permission by the town. We broke through the granite doorway. You can see the lintel on the top, the long granite lintel. And we could discern the door from that. We knew there was a door at one time there by some of the pictures that we had. There was also a vent hole up here which is covered up by mortar. So we punched it open, and as I understand it, was sealed in 1928. And sometime during World War II, some of the vandals that came here punched a hole and got into the magazine, but the town quickly sealed it up. But they gave us permission. We had a door made, a steel door, so we can go in and out of the magazine. We do fire the guns, as you know now, and at certain occasions, commemorating you know, some of the military history of the fort. So we have access to the fort, and people, local people and tourists, like to go in there from time to time. The only thing is it's so dark in there, you can hardly hold your own hand. 1926, when finally it became available, the federal government offered it as surplus property and offered it to the town of Fairhaven, who didn't have the $5,000 to purchase it. It was then offered to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and they really had no need for the fort. And then it went on to Bristol County, and they had no need nor the money to do it. And the town certainly could not afford it. So Lady Fairhaven, Lady Broughton, who was the daughter of Henry Huddleston Rogers, whose mansion, if you look at some of the old photos, was right within view here. And if you see by the documentation on the Great Ledge that her father loved this spot. So in his name, she purchased it for $5,000 from the federal government. The papers were passed, and it was offered to the town as a permanent park. Now there's a stipulation in the deed. Should this ever cease as a public park, it automatically and without charge reverts back to the federal government. So keeping that in mind, so nothing can ever be built here, and because it's not a question of if it was solicited by the government. It automatically goes back to the government by virtue of the arrangement made in the deed. After the government released the fort as an active fort, the cannons, you know, the caretaker Wetzel over the winter. It's a very cold, isolated spot in those days. Didn't have modern heating equipment in the house in which they lived. So they probably, as the cannons rotted, they took the wood and burned it in the stove. And many of the old photographs show the guns, the cannon barrels lying on the ground. Well, there's someone came along from New York who had a big estate on the Hudson River and offered to purchase the cannons from the government, and the deal was going through. Well, this caused an outrage by the townspeople and said the cannons belong here as part of the character of the fort. It's part of Fairhaven. So the gentleman that purchased it and was going to bring it up on the Hudson River said, look, I'll tell you what I'll do. If you house the cannons properly, I'll leave the guns here. So $325 was raised by virtue of clam bakes, by softball games, and whatever ways they solicited money. It doesn't sound like much now, but in those days, I guess it was a great sum of money, $325. And the carriages were built. And if you look at some of the old photos, and I'm talking the 20s and 30s and early 40s, the carriages are not of this character. This is the proper carriage, minus the wheels, for these guns, as we got the plans from the federal government from the archive, so we know they're correct. So it was just, they were made out of North Carolina white pine, but they've gone through 3 or 4 sets of carriages. They're barbette carriages, they're called. And one of our guys, Arthur Fortier, over the last, since then, 75, made all of these by hand, cut them, drilled holes, made the drills, and housed them again. The wood was donated by a Delano sawmill. It's native solid oak and a great weight to them. But you know, we have a feeling for the fort, and this is why I like to do these things, the reenactments. They're a lot of work, and you really got to touch a lot of bases to pull something like this off. There's always a chance someone could get hurt.